You're listening to Release Your Resistance with Bex Beltran, episode 43. Welcome to Release Your Resistance. This is Bex. The only reason why any of us don't have what we want in life is because of our own resistance. Right now, I'm learning how to recognize and release my resistance, and this podcast tells you how you can release your resistance so that you can live the exact life that you want. Let's get started. Today's episode is all about critical thinking, which is a stark and fun contrast to my last episode, which was tarot and describing my tarot journey and the lessons from learning and embracing tarot. So today is the complete opposite other end of that scale for anyone who is more interested in the more logical, rational, and reasonable side of thinking. The interesting thing that I think about myself when I consider the topic of critical thinking is that, of course, I had heard the phrase in my early adulthood and never gave it too much thought until I specifically remember once in a work situation, someone in charge of a meeting asked a question and the whole room was silent. Nobody answered. So the person said, "Come on, use your critical thinking skills. What does XYZ mean?" And I remember at that point recognizing that while I had heard the phrase critical thinking before, I didn't really know what it meant. And I was already an adult in the workforce by this point. And I remember feeling confused by the term critical thinking. I don't think I ever had a critical thinking course, or if I did, I didn't remember a specific class or lesson in elementary school or high school. And I really don't remember being exposed to it as a standalone topic in college. And the reason why I think this is funny is because many years later, I was hired as an adjunct faculty member, and one of the courses that I was approved to teach was called Research Methods. And really, it was a critical thinking course. So obviously, I was qualified to teach it based on my educational transcript and my resume, even though I could not put specific words to a definition. It makes me further believe one of my very favorite expressions, which is, the best way to learn something is to teach it. So today, I want to give you my personal definition of critical thinking and tell you why, through teaching that Research Methods course, I fell in love with the idea of critical thinking. I want to give you some examples of how you can use critical thinking as you evaluate the messages and offers and suggestions that you get from the outside world, and more importantly, how you can use critical thinking to evaluate the messages and offers and suggestions that you get from your own brain. So first, let's talk about critical thinking. Did you feel that same panic or maybe just uncertainty that I felt in that work meeting when I mentioned this topic today? Did you feel like, well, yeah, this is a familiar phrase, but actually, I don't even really know what she's referring to when she says critical thinking? Or is this just a normal, everyday phrase that you could use and understand in any kind of context? And how often do you think about your own thinking? How often do you think about critical thinking? You know, that is one of my favorite things to do. It's get awareness around my thoughts and then decide intentionally which thoughts I want to keep and which thoughts are no longer helpful to me or were never helpful to me in the first place. So my question to you to set the stage for this episode is, how often do you think about thinking? And how often do you think critically about your own thinking? My goals for this episode are to, first of all, give you a definition of critical thinking. Then I want to talk about why we don't think critically all the time, what is standing in our way from employing our own critical thinking abilities, and then I'll finish by giving you a few suggestions of how you can practice critical thinking every day. The dictionary definition of critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. So that sounds pretty academic and maybe even a little scientific. Basically, what that means is when you think critically, you analyze and evaluate without bias before making a decision about whatever the topic is. My more conversational layperson definition of critical thinking is that it's thinking about the source of the message, thinking about the motivation of that source, and then using logic and reason to evaluate the source instead of using emotion to make a decision about the message. I also include noticing thinking errors in my own definition of critical thinking. And the other addition that I've made to my own definition of critical thinking is that it is using your prefrontal cortex, not the primitive brain, in decision making. So let's explore each of those elements individually. When I think about a message, I like to think about who is the source of this message. And what is the motivation of that source? A very simplistic way to do this would be to ask yourself, who's sending this message? Is it a friend, a family member, a stranger, an advertiser, a salesperson? Is it someone who wants something from me? Or is it someone who wants something for me? Another differentiation that we make, maybe almost immediately or subconsciously or subliminally, is asking if the motivation of the messenger is to inform or to influence or to validate or to flatter. What are they trying to do? We are instantly trying to figure out why this source is sending us this message. Well, maybe it's not so instant. Maybe if you're not in the habit of critical thinking, you don't naturally ask yourself this question. One thing that is so interesting about noticing the source and the motivation of the message is that you may evaluate the same message differently based on who the source is or who you think the source is. If politician A says something, there would be a group of people who would believe it and who would agree with it. And then if they discovered that it was misquoted and it was actually politician B who said it, that same message with exactly the same delivery and meaning, suddenly all the people who agreed and believed with the message from politician A would find themselves disagreeing and not believing the message just because it came from B. Isn't that so crazy? And I have to say, I might be guilty of that same flip-floppery when I am not aware of what I'm thinking and why. Let's talk about sources and motivation. Imagine that a friend of mine listens to this episode today, and after she listens to it, she sends me a message that says, "I loved that episode. You did an excellent job." So if I think about the source, my friend, and her motivation, why she sent me that message, I can imagine that her motivation could be to make me feel good, or maybe to share her joy and appreciation with me. And maybe she is trying to deepen our connection. Or maybe she just wants to inform me that she liked the episode. If another friend sends me a different message that has nothing to do with this episode and nothing to do with me, really, if she just wants to tell me that she just finished watching a television series that she really enjoyed and she thought I would enjoy it too, maybe her motivation is just to inform me about something that she likes. Maybe she's also trying to establish a deeper connection with me by encouraging me to watch and like the same thing that she watched and liked. So maybe she is trying to influence my behavior. See, we really haven't had to employ a whole lot of critical thinking yet with these two examples of messages from friends. We can just guess that their only motivation is probably just to share and inform and maybe to feel a deeper connection. Another example of a message that we could dig into deeper to evaluate would be if we're driving on the freeway and we see an electronic billboard that is created and maintained by the Department of Transportation. And that billboard has a message that says, "Click it or ticket." So the source of the message is the state's Department of Transportation, or maybe it's an engineer in that department, or maybe a policymaker, or maybe a safety specialist. The source could also be the Department of Public Safety. I'm actually not sure who creates and directs and maintains those public service announcements that we see on the freeway. When I think about what is the motivation of that message, I think it's to catch my attention with an easy-to-remember slogan. And I think the motivation is to influence my behavior to buckle my seatbelt and remind me to buckle my seatbelt. And maybe it's even to plant an easy-to-remember slogan into my brain so that I end up repeating that slogan to myself and to other people because it's a fun thing to say, click it or tick it. The message is also creating a little bit of a warning for me. It is suggesting that if I don't click it, if I don't have my seatbelt buckled, there is a chance that I could have a negative monetary repercussion. I could get a ticket. And the motivation of that sign isn't even implying or suggesting the real danger of not wearing a seatbelt, which is that I could die in an accident if I weren't using that safety feature. It's so interesting to dig in deeper to that message that's being delivered by either the Department of Public Safety or Department of Transportation or maybe some other governmental agency and wonder, what action are they trying to influence me to do, and for what result, and for whose benefit? Another sign we might see while we're driving down the freeway, this time not created or maintained by a governmental agency, but actually owned and operated and maintained by a business, is an advertising billboard. The billboard might have a message telling me to buy something or check something out or go to a website or call a lawyer. In that case, the source of the message is the business or the advertiser, and the motivation of the message is still to inform me or to make me aware of something or maybe to remind me of something. For example, a brand or a business. And maybe I hadn't been aware of it before, or maybe the intention is to put something memorable in my mind, like a logo or a slogan or a product name, or to remind me of a phone number or a website, with the hopes that I will go and visit that or take action on it later when I'm not driving. Those are all examples of how we could evaluate a message and notice who's the source of the message, what's the motivation of the message. What are they trying to get me to do? When I think about the message and evaluating the message, I always like to translate the word message and replace it with the word offer. I like to think of any input I receive as an offer because that reminds me that I always have the option to accept or decline. I always get to decide what I want to do with whatever I am being presented with. When I get a message or offer, I might evaluate it based on who it's coming from. Is it a friend or a foe? Someone I like or someone who I don't like? I can consider if this offer is a threat or a gift. Is it taking something away from me, or is it offering me a benefit or an advantage? Up to this point, if we apply my definition of critical thinking to a message, we are basically judging and deciding on who is the source of the message, what is the motivation of the message, and how should I evaluate this message. You can do this quick exercise, not only with messages that you get from the outside world, from advertisements and from friends and from social media, but you can also do this quick evaluation with messages that you get from inside of your own head. You can consider your thoughts and consider, what's the source of this thought? Is it my amygdala, my primitive brain, the fear and threat detection center? Or is it the logical, rational prefrontal cortex part of my brain, which can think strategically and think of long-term consequences and benefits? Is it the part of my brain that's willing to prolong pleasure in order to have a greater benefit later? Or is it the part of my brain that doesn't think about 3 steps ahead and only knows pain, bad, pleasure, good? Another way we can use critical thinking when evaluating messages, either from the outside world or from inside of our own brains, is to think about if there are any errors in thinking, or fallacies. A fallacy is faulty reasoning. It's a mistaken belief, especially when it's based on an unsound argument. Sometimes I notice that many of my thoughts at times seem to be based on unsound arguments. I think I might do a whole episode about lies I tell myself and believe. That is what resistance is. Resistance is the thoughts you tell yourself and believe about why something isn't possible, or about why you can't do something, or about why this would never work, or about why people won't like it if you did this, or all of the other lies that you tell yourself that result in resistance. When I used to teach that critical thinking class, one of the exercises that we would do was to review and come up with examples of all the different types of logical fallacies, like hasty generalization and logic turned on its head and straw man and appealing to guruhood. And if you are interested in learning about these logical fallacies, I really recommend you Google it, because it is really interesting to find those descriptions and examples and then start noticing them and catch them when you hear them from other people, from the media, in news reports. And it's the most interesting to catch them when you're in a personal argument or conversation with a friend or family member or enemy. And for me, the most interesting place to catch these fallacies is when I hear them from inside of my own brain. One of these fallacies that I frequently fall victim to is the crowd factor. I notice that I feel a lot more calm and reassured about a decision if other people are making the same decision. And this makes perfect sense. This is my human brain. This is a time and energy saving thinking shortcut that tells me, well, if other people are doing this, then it must be safe, or it must be appropriate, or it must be okay. Well, that is a fallacy. I can notice that when I make a decision based on the actions or opinions of, quote unquote, the crowd, instead of fear of missing out, you've heard of this, FOMO, I actually like to call this one fear of being left out, FOBLO. I'm just curious if you have any examples of that in your own life. If you go along with something without even really questioning it, without even really noticing if you want to go along with the crowd, or if you agree with the crowd, or if the crowd has any additional certainty if this is the right choice for you or not. Let's switch gears a little here and talk about, why don't we think critically all the time? If it's better, if it's based on the better part of our brain, why don't we do it? Well, I already brought up the idea that when you evaluate the source of your own thinking and your own messages and offers, you may be getting an idea from your primitive brain, or you may be getting a suggestion from your prefrontal cortex. And knowing that, my belief is that the reason why we don't think critically all the time is because it really actually does take longer. It is not as instantaneous as just following the suggestion or the utterance or the urge that comes from your primitive brain. Obviously, thinking critically and taking the time to slow down and evaluate and consider takes more of our own mental capacity and energy as well. And the most basic reason, I just don't think we're in the habit of thinking critically. Remember that question that I asked you at the beginning? Maybe we just don't think about our thinking often enough. Even just this awareness that frequently we follow the directives and suggestions of our primitive brain without considering if this is really what we want in the long term, if this is really beneficial to us, if we are believing a lie that we're telling ourselves or acting on a fallacy that our brain has come up with for us, we can give ourselves a little grace and forgiveness and compassion for noticing that, of course, we don't think critically all the time. Of course, we don't slow ourselves down to evaluate and consider. We don't do this, and other people don't do this. So it lets us be forgiving and compassionate and graceful to our friends and family members and our media and even our politicians and our strangers who also don't think critically all the time. We're just not in the habit to do it. And it does take more energy. If you are completely excited and interested now to learn about how you can think critically more often and develop this habit, and maybe even be an example to all those friends and family members and coworkers and strangers, here are 3 suggestions about how you can practice critical thinking every day. The first thing you can do is ask yourself, how do I know that this is the case? You can get curious about it. You can backtrack to the source of the information to figure it out, if it is, in fact, the case or not. The second thing you can do is ask yourself, who's telling me this and why? And this question applies both to external messages that you get from outside of your brain, from other people, from the media, from strangers, as well as the internal messages that you create for yourself in your own mind. So ask yourself, who is telling me this and why this message or this offer? And then the third suggestion that I have for you about how you can think critically more frequently is to not only notice your thoughts, but also notice how you're feeling. So when you think a thought, when you notice that you have a suggestion or a message or an offer, you can check in with your body. Notice, do you currently feel threatened? Do you feel angry? Or does this message make you feel calm? Does this offer make you feel more abundant or hopeful or excited? I think your emotions are useful in helping you notice what part of your brain is giving you information about a message or an offer. If you notice yourself getting angry while you're reading a news story, you can then backtrack a little bit and wonder, why am I getting angry? Do I feel threatened? Do I feel fear? What part of reading this news story is making me feel threat or fear? Just dropping into your emotion and noticing the emotion that's associated as you're receiving the message might help you stop and remember, wait a second, who's the source of this message and what is their motivation? Are they trying to scare me with this article in order for me to take action? Or am I just reading neutral facts that I personally have thoughts about, and those thoughts are coming from my amygdala and they are fear-based thoughts? In that case, the message of fear might just be coming from inside of your own brain and not necessarily the outside information. Just to sum up the message and the offer that I am giving you right now, my motivation is absolutely to inform you and to influence your behavior, and also to deepen my connection with you. I am suggesting that you consider who's telling you what and why whenever you get a message, either from outside or inside of your own head. And I am suggesting that you notice if you're falling victim to any errors in logic. And I hope you do decide to check in with your emotions when you take in a message so that you can better determine which part of your brain is responding. Is it the fear center or the logical, rational center of your brain? And now I also want to influence you to take action. I want you to tell me your reaction to my definition and suggestions so I can think critically about what you have to say. Send me an email at hi@bexby.org or leave me a comment in the show notes at bexby.org/critical. And if you are one of my favorite people, meaning you are on my email list, this week I have emailed you an excerpt of one of the old assignments I used to share with my critical thinking students. It summarizes 6 habits that hinder thinking. You can take a look at the list of habits to see if you recognize any of them and decide if you want to drop any of those habits. And if you're not on my email list yet, I'm wondering if you would be influenced by a little bit of faux blow, fear of being left out by not being one of my favorite people. If so, just go to bexby.org/favorites to give me your email address and you will not be left out of anything. And one more thing before we go today, if you have noticed yourself feeling uncertain or notice yourself wishing that you could control things that seem out of control, the message I want to share with you is the only certainty we know for sure is uncertainty. The only constant is change. The only thing you could ever control is your own thinking. This is what I work on with my weekly coaching clients. So to create some certainty and control for you in the final months of 2020, I am offering an end of 2020 coaching special for the remaining months of this special year. We will have a personal coaching call once a week for the rest of October, November, and December of 2020 to help you make sense of what's happened in your life in 2020 and what you want to create for yourself in 2021. If this sounds perfect for you, or if you're curious if this might be helpful for you, just go to my website, bexb.org, and check out the link that says, Work with Me. Let's set something up for you. Okay, that is it. Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed hearing my theories on critical thinking, and I will talk to you next week. This has been Release Your Resistance. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, think about someone who you know who would love this episode and share it with them. There should be a share button on your app if you're listening to this on your phone. If you'd like to continue this conversation one-on-one or in real time, come visit me on my site at bexb.org to see how we can work together.